and I will introduce our three panelists for this last keynote panel for the conference, which is entitled Truth Telling, Healing, and Restoring Trust in the Church, Envisioning Interdisciplinary Support for Pastoral Care in the Aftermath of Abuse. And I will begin by reading the bios for our three panelists. This will in part allow people to get in here from the hallway, which I see they're streaming in the door. Dr. Julia Fetter received her PhD from the University of Notre Dame and is an associate professor of theology at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. She specializes in theological anthropology, theologies of suffering, sexual trauma, and human evolution. Her current book project, titled Saving Grace, Sexual Trauma, and Christian Salvation, details how Christian ideas about salvation have contributed to sexual violence in our communities, but also can foster resistance to sexual violence and even support post-traumatic healing. At Creighton, she leads an interdisciplinary research team to investigate the ways that the Jesuits handled the case of Daniel Kenny, a former Jesuit priest who taught theology and sex education at Creighton Preparatory School until he was dismissed after a credible accusation of sexual abuse of a student in 1989. Dr. Peter Capretto is an assistant professor of pastoral care in religion and culture at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His research explores how social experiences such as empathy shape the ethics and politics of care, specifically around trauma, disability, and race. His writings on politics and theology have appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Los Angeles Review of Books, the Heathrop Journal, and various scholarly anthologies. He is co-editor of Trauma and Transcendence, Suffering and the Limits of Theory, Fordham University Press, 2018. Trained clinically as a hospice chaplain, pastoral counselor, and crisis counselor, Dr. Capretto uses his teaching and writing to situate theories of care in close proximity to cultured and living experiences of psychic trauma, loss, and mourning. He holds a PhD in religion, psychology, and culture from Vanderbilt University. And finally, Patrick Wall. Patrick Wall has 31 years of experience investigating, researching, testifying, publishing, and assisting district attorneys, civil lawyers, and bankruptcy lawyers on clerical sexual assault cases against minors. Mr. Wall is a former Benedictine monk and priest from St. John's Abbey, having worked for 6 years in the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. Patrick joined Jeff Anderson and Associates in 2012 after working at Manley and Stewart for a decade. Mr. Wall also serves as a subject matter expert on artificial intelligence and stem cell research projects. Patrick has had the privilege to listen to survivors from Alaska to Ireland and can think of no higher calling than child protection and healing. Patrick resides in Los Angeles, California, enjoying spending free time with his adult daughter, hiking, experiencing the Getty, and some occasional Johnny football. Thanks, and Dr. Fetter.
Hi, can folks hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, wonderful. I want to thank Professors Belcher and Claremont their work to organize this conference on this very important topic and their invitation to participate. Professors Belcher and Claremont posed a series of questions for us as panelists to consider, including one that really captured my attention. How can the church be a truth-telling community? I will speak to this question as an academic researcher doing work on clergy sexual abuse in the Roman Catholic Church, and I want to share with you what I have learned so far about how the church is and is not yet a truth-telling community from my experience as an academic researcher. So 2 fundamental claims guide my comments today. First, if the church is to be a truth-telling community, it needs to develop a posture of non-defensive transparency. And second, we as a church have not yet committed to non-defensive transparency. So I teach theology at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, and along with 2 of my colleagues, one historian and one criminologist, I've been working on a research project, so this was referenced briefly in my bio, And this research project traces the effects of sexual abuse of minors by one Jesuit priest, Daniel Kenny, throughout our local community of Omaha and beyond. Daniel Kenny was born in 1932. He worked at Creighton Preparatory School, a Jesuit all-boys high school, as an instructor of theology and sex education from 1965 to 1989. While there, Kenny gained notoriety as the charismatic monkey priest because he used a monkey puppet named Buford to connect with children and to raise money for children's causes. He founded two charitable organizations centered on supporting economically disadvantaged children, Operation Others and the Buford Foundation, named after the puppet, right? Both were successful in part due to Kenny's magnetic personality and fundraising capabilities. In 1989, however, Creighton Preparatory School dismissed Kenny in response to a credible accusation of sexual abuse of a prep student, although little was known of this accusation in the broader Omaha community. Kenny was then moved from the relatively affluent and predominantly white high school to colonized settings, Red Cloud Indian School in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where he stayed for just 5 months, and then to Holy Family Basilica in Nairobi, Kenya, where he resided for a decade, from 1993 to 2003. In 2003, Kenny was removed from public ministry and brought back to the United States. After Kenny's initial dismissal from prep, at least that we know of, 7 other accusations were made by former Creighton prep students and deemed credible by the Midwest Jesuits. And those accusations became known in 2018 when the Omaha Archdiocese and the Midwest Jesuits publicly named Kenny as a priest credibly accused of the sexual abuse of minors. Since then, additional former Creighton prep students have reported instances of sexual abuse by Kenny to the Omaha World Herald, our local newspaper, but very little is known regarding the breadth of the abuse or the institutional context in which it took place and that it subsequently reveals. So our project is to speak with survivors, witnesses, and administrators to seek to stitch together a portrait of what happened in Daniel Kenny's case, how and why decisions were made, what wounds remain, and how Jesuit institutions might better care for minors in the future. So this research project is funded by Fordham University's Taking Responsibility Initiative, an effort to help Jesuit educational institutions to confront the causes and legacy of clergy sexual abuse. Now, in order to receive these funds, my research team developed our research agenda in cooperation with Jesuit educators at Fordham, incorporated feedback, and eventually received approval from their grant board. Then we went through a rigorous process of incorporating feedback and receiving approval from our own Jesuit institution. Now, I mention this because I want to indicate the degree to which this research has been formed by Jesuit Catholic institutions for Jesuit Catholic institutions. To the extent that we have encountered significant resistance to carrying out this research is all the more surprising, I think, in light of this initial care with which our research agenda was crafted to begin with. So enough background right now. I'm going to return to some of the details of my experience in a moment, but I want to flesh out my core claim about non-defensive transparency. Now, some of this should be obvious, but why is non-defensive transparency needed? Well, as we know, secrecy is fundamental to the perpetuation of sexual abuse. Secrecy allows perpetrators to continue unchecked, and secrecy keeps victims in a state of shame and self-blame. As psychotherapist Judith Herman argues, secrecy and silence are the perpetrator's first line of defense. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the credibility of his victim. If he cannot silence her absolutely, he tries to make sure that no one listens. The more powerful the perpetrator, the greater is his prerogative to name and define reality, and the more completely his arguments prevail. So clear and transparent accounting of the violations that have happened within our communities, I argue, does not re-traumatize victims. It gives victims encouragement to talk about what has happened to them and to get the services that they need to heal. Clear and transparent conversation about sexual abuse also communicates to perpetrators that violence will not be tolerated, and that can function as a deterrent to future abuse. And it empowers bystanders to intervene when they recognize current situations that might be abusive. So again, as Judith Herman argues, the ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud, but only when truth is finally recognized, survivors can begin recovery. So non-defensive transparency is required for building trust in the church as an institution. One interviewee put it this way to us. He said, "I want to know who knew, how long it was going on, and what is the punishment." Now, this person who talked with us was a student at Creighton Preparatory High School in the mid-1970s during Kenny's tenure. He loved and trusted Father Kenny, and he loved and trusted his high school. He also loved many of his classmates who he now wonders whether if they were some of the victimized. He wants to think back to his own high school education fondly, to give money to his alma mater, and to participate in alumni events, but he isn't sure whether he can and should trust any of his experiences. As he told us, quote, "To regain trust, I need a reconciliation process," end quote. But he can't remember Creighton Prep addressing directly what happened. He and all of the alumni that we have interviewed heard about Kenny's abuse through the newspapers or through a friend, rather than from the high school itself. And no one that we interviewed was aware of any consequences that Kenny received. It was often only through contact with our research team that anyone knew that Kenny had been removed from ministry in 2003 or laicized in 2020. In fact, Kenny was removed from ministry 14 years after his removal from Creighton Prep High School for the initial credible allegation of abuse. In the interim, as I mentioned, Kenny was placed in ministry positions in South Dakota among the Lakota tribe and in Nairobi, both locations where allegations of sexual abuse are historically underreported. Kenny's removal from ministry was reported in the newspapers and clearly reported in the list of accused priests released by the Archdiocese and the Midwest Jesuits in 2018. But his laicization happened very quietly in November of 2020. As researchers ourselves, poring over this case for hours every week, we almost missed the fact that he had been laicized ourselves. And it is completely opaque to us whether this was a disciplinary consequence or a response to a request from Kenny himself. And the difference between these two options seemed to matter to those alumni that we have interviewed. As a disciplinary response, it would represent the Jesuits taking seriously harm that had been done to victim survivors. Now, I talk about my experience as a researcher only as a case study. I don't think that my experience is at all unique, in part because I participate in a network of scholars funded by Fordham University doing similar research. We meet once a quarter to share our experiences and exchange advice, and much of what I share with you today is mirrored in their experiences as well. There are three elements that characterize my experience as a researcher attempting to uncover information about clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic Church: lack of access to information, confusion about insider-outsider boundaries, and of course, institutional defensiveness. So first, we have encountered a surprising lack of access to information. Despite being commissioned and blessed by more than one Jesuit institution to conduct this research, we have encountered many difficulties in uncovering the information needed to complete the research. The overwhelming majority of Jesuit priests and administrators we have contacted for interviews have denied our requests, most citing some of the following reasons in some kind of combination, right? They're not at liberty to discuss personnel issues. It's unjust to discuss this case at all for fear of compromising victim confidentiality, or they don't really know anything that would help us to understand this case. So the first reason, classifying this as a personnel issue, sidesteps the real issues at play here. Academic researchers are poised to help Catholic institutions identify patterns of problems among their personnel and to help them to identify solutions if institutions are willing to share that information with researchers. Jesuits have often pointed us in the direction of their own victim advocate coordinators for our questions. And the fact that these victim advocate coordinators exist is evidence that they're working hard to avoid further abuses. But when we have asked the victim advocate coordinator whether she's equipped to do any of this systemic analysis of the Jesuit abuse crisis or to draw out any patterns from individual cases, she has flatly told us no, she is not in a position to do this. And this is precisely where academic research can contribute. Our research team, we have a theologian, an American historian, and a criminologist. We have the tools to do this kind of analysis, but we do not have access to the data. Second, we have encountered a surprising and confusing set of signals about insider-outsider boundaries during the course of our research. So not surprising to us, I want to start with what's not surprising, is a boundary drawing within Catholic institutions between those who operate within the institution as priests, lay ministers, educators, and students, from outsiders such as journalists and the media. That wasn't surprising to us. Catholic institutional actors are wary of journalists looking for a gotcha story and are nervous about fabricated public relations scandals. Now, bracketing whether this suspicion of journalists is itself warranted or not, we have been surprised by the number of times that Catholic clergy and administrators explicitly express nervousness about us as academic researchers, comparing us to journalists. Though we ourselves are Catholic educators, funded by Catholic research money and rigorously monitored and approved by a Catholic institutional review board in order to ensure that we do not compromise the dignity of our research subjects, we are often seen as nothing more than individuals seeking out salacious details to create a public relations crisis when there really is none. As one Jesuit administrator told us, quote, "While I believe that your assurances that you are researchers and not legal scholars or journalists are offered in good faith, I hope that you can understand that from our perspective, that this is a distinction without a difference. A project such as this is certainly a public relations matter, no different than if this research were undertaken by a journalist," end quote. Now, I want to note that these comments are from an administrator at an educational institution. Now, if there's no distinction between academic research and the work of journalists, even in the minds of educational administrators, we have traded a sense of the integrity and worth of academic research for anxiety about public relations and protecting institutional funds. Third, we have encountered pervasive institutional defensiveness. Instead of committing to non-defensive transparency as the foundation for trust, many of our institutions wish to build trust by talking constantly about how trustworthy they are. Assuring the public over and over again that they can trust an organization is not the same thing as actually earning or building that trust. As my research team has approached Jesuits and administrators of Jesuit institutions seeking information about the case that we are researching, We have been denied access to concrete information, while at the same time assured repeatedly that Jesuit protocols are sufficient for addressing abuse, and so we don't need to investigate them. As one Jesuit put it to us, while he was declining to be interviewed for the project, he advised us to pivot from investigating Daniel Kenny's case to reporting on how the church has, quote, taken steps to rectify its procedures and processes so that the painful past is not repeated. He assured us, I could put you in touch with the experts on all that has been done to put safety valves in place. But when we contacted those individuals, they wouldn't consent to interviews either. They would only provide emailed answers to questions in line with protocols that they have developed as standard responses to journalists. But again, we're not journalists. We are academics working for a Jesuit institution, funded by a Jesuit institution, and approved by a board of our peers with the express mission to help Jesuit institutions to do their work in more effective and faith-filled ways. The familiar adage, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, applies here. All is a public relations crisis, and so information is locked down, and institutions treat all investigators defensively. This is not the path forward to a reconciliation process that wounded individuals like the alum that I mentioned earlier desires. Non-defensive transparency is needed to begin the process of healing wounds that secrecy has generated. We can't move on from what has happened until we really know what happened, how long it was going on, who knew about it, and what are the consequences for those involved. Talking honestly about these things will not re-traumatize victims, nor need it compromise their confidentiality. If confidentiality is a genuine concern, and I have some doubts about whether it is, let's work together as administrators and researchers to strategize about how to protect that confidentiality. I welcome suggestions about how to improve my team's commitment to maintaining the dignity of our research subject, and I think that many other researchers would welcome that as well. In fact, that's an integral part of the process of doing academic research. By belonging to a university community, we willingly submit ourselves to this kind of critique from our peers. So let's talk practically and concretely about improving victim confidentiality, but don't use that as an excuse to cut off research. We as a church are not in a position to move on from the abuse crisis yet. We need to know more about what has gotten us here, who has been harmed, and what we can do to protect vulnerable people. Academic research has an integral role to play in answering these questions, but researchers need support and access to information to do this work. But right now, many researchers are met with hostility, defensiveness, and lack of access to information. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Excellent. I debated about sharing a title. I have difficulty working without one. I think I will foreground it here. I think it wasn't planned this way, but Dr. Feder and I will have a bit more overlap than I originally planned. The title that I'm working from today is From Neoliberal Compliance to Accomplice, Resistance to Survivor-Centered Pastoral Care. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about defensiveness and resistance. Anyone who has spent time on the practical side of theological education will tell you there is a peculiar challenge faced when training future faith leaders. While theologians are neither the therapists nor pastors of their students, it is also a dereliction of our responsibility to the spiritual formation of our students to neglect their personal development. One of the grounding principles of work in chaplaincy and spiritual care emerges from the founder of the modern clinical pastoral education movement, Anton Boysen, who insisted that any chance for theology to live up to its name requires that we treat those whom we serve as what he called living human documents. You may be familiar with this if you've gone through CPE yourself. Whenever I share this principle with my intro pastoral care students, it is often met with immediate appreciation, where students typically understand this principle to be saying, we need to take the lived experience of others seriously. Lived experience matters. This, of course, is true. As fraught as the concept of lived experience or Erlebnis is in the history of philosophy, phenomenology, and trauma theory, much of the harm enacted by ecclesial and cultural institutions is indeed a function of a lack of respect for the lived experiences of others. However, reducing Boysen's insight merely to a comment about lived experience also misses something crucial about what it means to approach one another as documents. Namely, we do not pay arbitrary deference to documents. Rather, we pay closer attention to them. Often this is to understand what these documents are saying, but just as commonly it is to discern what those documents do not speak to. Strangely, this sort of attention is more demanding than deference. Anyone who has had to put in the personal work to refrain from oversharing with others, so as not to co-opt a pastoral or therapeutic space to work out one's own emotional baggage, will understand that treating ourselves and those around us as living human documents just as frequently involves a negative or apophatic process. In the context of my work training future pastoral caregivers, I'm finding myself with greater regularity saying to them something I hadn't anticipated needing to communicate, and that is, your story is both more important and less important than you may realize. I would insist to you that much of the labor of spiritual formation is this process of discerning where epistemic deference ends and where countertransference begins. I am, of course, no exception to this rule. My story matters for this conversation, and it doesn't. Yet I hope the point licenses me to situate myself ever so briefly as I venture into this conversation on truth-telling, healing, and pastoral care in the midst of abuse. I'll spare you the longer narrative and offer just two contextual details that I would encourage you to keep in mind and to scrutinize as I labor to respond to the questions posed to our panel, of which I'll have to confess I'll only scratch the surface in my time today. The first is that while I was born to an immigrant Italian Roman Catholic family, I am not Catholic. To my knowledge, I am the first Capretto on the planet who was not baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. Even my one older brother, who's a mere 4 years older than me, was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church before my Sicilian father and waspy mother gave up hope with me. It must have been like one very ugly baby, I have to imagine. So be afraid, be very afraid. The second is that my theological context is as a pastoral theologian and sometimes philosopher of religion when they let me, in what I would describe as a very progressive standalone seminary in the Disciples of Christ at Phillips Theological Seminary. This is a theological context where it took 3 semesters of teaching before I had my first straight white man in the class, and where there are sizable Black, trans, queer, and indigenous students there. Naturally, that progressivism is also present in the theology of the student body, most of whom are from lower and working class backgrounds, a very different student population perhaps than here at Notre Dame. It wasn't supposed to be that much of a joke. Yeah. However, lest you think that this disparity in context leads me to a sense of moral purity as I enter this conversation on sexual abuse and advocacy, allow me to assure you that this couldn't be further from the case. This is not just because, by virtue of that peculiar upbringing I just mentioned, I had the privilege of hearing members from either side of my extended family inquire earnestly about the Protestants and Catholics on the other side. Do they even view themselves as Christian? I wish that were a joke. Rather, it is because one of the biggest pedagogical obstacles I face in working with progressive seminarians is overcoming their self-assurance that they and their liberal congregations are impervious to the patterns of abuse that have more often been strongly associated with Catholic and evangelical churches. Not only have faith leaders in progressive, open and affirming, and liberal Protestant congregations enacted many of the same sexual violences against their congregants, and not only have they frequently failed to advocate for survivors of sexual violence under their auspices, but the veneer of sexual inclusivity and allyship has also very often made them more resistant to holding themselves accountable for these failures. While I would not go so far as to argue that this means progressive Protestants face a more difficult task than Catholics in building trust in relation to abuse, there is no question in my mind that very few things are more damaging to the prospect of long-term trust building than an unwavering commitment to the idea that one's faith community is beyond reproach when it comes to pastoral care for abuse. There is, on this note, I should say, nothing inherently wrong with being defensive, insofar as defensiveness is very often what makes surviving trauma possible. All too often, pastoral caregivers misunderstand the importance of bringing one's full self as somehow implying that trauma responses like dissociation and compartmentalization are somehow not authentic, which is nothing more than an overconfident form of victim blaming cloaked in pop psychology. The pejorative connotation that we tend to associate with defensiveness derives more precisely from defensiveness that follows identification. That is, we become defensive about things that are important to us, identities that are important to us, yet which we feel uncertain about. Defensiveness then becomes a proxy for overzealous insecurity, which often does warrant some critique. Of course, it's all too easy to point out the defensive insecurities of our social and political rivals, some of whom identify so intensely with masculine bravado and grotesque fantasies of white power that merely drawing attention to these traits sends them racing to Twitter to protest just a bit too much. Yet no one is without identification, and each of us has things we want to believe about ourselves. I'm not a racist. I've not internalized misogyny. I may not be perfect, but deep down, I'm a good person. Or more innocently, in a room such as this, I'm sure none of us over-identify with our aspiration to be seen by others as intelligent, and have never become defensive at anyone suggesting otherwise. This is noteworthy what psychotherapists refer to as a lie. This is not to suggest that all identifications and their ensuing defenses are equal. While over-identifying as a good preacher may breed some homiletical stagnancy in the long term, over-identifying as a good white person who is not racist will rather quickly make oneself immune to opportunities for growth as an accomplice against white supremacy. These patterns are not on the same playing field, and we should all have a low level of tolerance for bad faith false equivalencies, which only ever tip the power back toward those who relish everyone except themselves, engaging in ever-escalating practices of self-flagellation. However, I do think that this helps us to identify what I'm convinced is perhaps the most crucial trap that threatens any answer to the question of how it is that the church can restore trust in the years ahead. That quite simply yet deceptively is the desire of faith leaders and the church to be viewed by others as trustworthy. Here the alliance with Dr. Fetter is very close. This, I recognize, is a peculiar identification to take aim at. Trust is, of course, a noble and crucial aim. While there is tremendous disagreement in developmental theories of identity and attachment among pastoral theologians and psychologists, there is a remarkable consensus on the importance of creating environments of trust for those around us. From cultivating secure attachments in children, to fostering strong therapeutic alliances, to journeying with survivors in recovery processes, trust is a durable constant. However, there is a subtle yet profoundly consequential difference between, on the one hand, a desire to restore one's sense of trustworthiness, and on the other, the intention to create a space that vulnerable persons feel they can actually trust. What is this difference? I would insist that it is more than a matter of mere rhetorical chicanery. The difference is that the desire to restore one's sense of trustworthiness will forever be beholden to the identification with a reputation, whereas the goal of creating a space that vulnerable persons can trust will readily forfeit that reputation if it means increasing a sense of safety for others. Perhaps this trap that I'm apparently trying to name of identification feels too abstract or impractical. Or perhaps you're skeptical of this distinction because, after all, you may contest, how will we ever be able to create spaces of trust for others unless we have successfully communicated to others that we are trustworthy? It's a fair question. So, what does avoiding this trap look like practically as a rubric for restoring trustworthy spaces for survivors of abuse and for creating a truth-telling community? An immediate obstacle, I must name, is that many of the most important answers to this question are so obvious that they risk being insulting to name in a crowd like ours. Churches must be willing to make not merely convenient but costly investments in the safety of survivors, centering their experiences and making it obvious to anyone looking on that our ecclesial bodies, Catholic, Protestant, or otherwise, genuinely care about the well-being of survivors more even than their own survival. Note that I describe these as obvious not because they're not difficult to follow through on, but rather precisely because it is so easy for someone like me to score cheap points by championing them, especially in a space like this where we are all ostensibly sold on the need to do better. As the youths sometimes say in a tone of derision, so stunning, so brave. So allow me, with that in mind, to put a bit more skin in the game and talk practically about what it might look like to negotiate this where I spend the overwhelming majority of my professional life, educating future faith leaders in pastoral care. Like many training future pastors, priests, and lay ministers, one of the prospects that keeps me up at night is the thought that one of my students will one day become someone who sexually abuses a congregant or someone in their community. I do not say this lightly. And before you contest, no, to the contrary, to one way that this is often deflected, I do not take personal responsibility or ownership for the actions of my students, but I'm also keenly aware that it would be a cowardly disavowal of my own institutional power to act as if I do not wield influence over my students on their paths to ordination, even if only through one measly required course with me. In dwelling on this prospect, my temptation, I'll confess to you all, and I'm realizing I'm saying this in front of a lot of priests, so just chill, is to give into the gravity of this fear and allow it to take center stage in the pedagogical tone I set with my students. What would this look like? Surprisingly, it looks quite responsible. It looks like making the focal point of pastoral care training around sexual abuse about boundaries training, liability management, and neoliberal compliance to legal structures that hopefully keep faith leaders out of the spotlight of crisis. Having surveyed the pastoral care curricula of every theological institution that is forthcoming with such data, with the important proviso that not all are forthcoming, I know for a fact that this is what much of the training in pastoral care for sexual abuse and trauma looks like. A very responsible program that hopefully helps alumni stay out of the headlines, helps university and theological institutions limit their legal liabilities, and helps professors like me ease our anxiety about advisees coming back to haunt them. One of the questions posed to our panel is this question of how theologians, psychologists, and lawyers can collaborate to better support pastoral care in the church. While I'm afraid that I'm only going to be able to gesture toward a response briefly, I can say with some confidence that any answer to this question that makes liability management a central concern is going to fail rather spectacularly in meeting the ambitions of restoring trust with survivors of church abuse. I feel like I may be losing people, so I will clarify further. There is, of course, nothing wrong with boundary training and compliance. The problem, rather, is how such focal points in the spiritual formation of future clergy frame what we understand as a trustworthy response to abuse. In their studies of behavioral discourse and electoral politics, many political scientists have coined what I believe is a helpful heuristic for tracking this pattern and problem, which is known as the Overton window. Some of you may already be familiar with this concept, but for those of you who aren't, the Overton window describes the spectrum of behavior that each of us deems as acceptable among a certain continuum. So in the world of electoral politics, this is most often used to explain how public opinion's sense of what counts as moderate shifts according to the mores of a particular moment. As the Republican Party declares a white supremacist insurrection on the Capitol that resulted in several deaths, quote, legitimate political discourse, Everyday voter disenfranchisement efforts and assaults on the health care that mitigates transgender youth suicide seems more normal and tolerable. When you feel a melancholic numbness upon witnessing institutional or cultural norms erode before your eyes, you are experiencing the Overton window shifting away from the moral arc of the universe, which you had hoped would be bending a bit more toward justice by now. Yet, one of the counterintuitive takeaways from this research is that, contrary to conventional thinking that a hearts and minds approach is best achieved through moderate incrementalism, the most effective way for political actors to shift someone's Overton window of acceptable behavior is not to target the margins of that window that is sort of targeting just at the edges of what is deemed acceptable behavior. Rather, if you want to shift a large group of people's behavior and thought in a particular direction, you need to aim far, far beyond the scope of what they previously viewed as acceptable behavior. Why? Because even if you are not successful in persuading the state of Texas that parents doing everything they can to keep their transgender children alive constitutes child abuse, you shift their gaze in the direction you want to take them. One thing both Catholics and Protestants seem to understand on a deep intuitive level is that their Overton windows of acceptable and expected pastoral intervention on sexual abuse have not merely been inadequate and not acceptable, but they have stagnated prematurely. The problem with boundaries training and fixation on neoliberal compliance is precisely because everyone in this room recognizes that these measures aren't even coming close to earning the trust of survivors of abuse and of younger generations for whom trust in the church has never been a default position. Even if such compliance measures are necessary, and I believe they are, they prime future clergy with a lukewarm sensibility. The way to build trust among survivors is to not abuse anyone. Stated baldly like this, one can already viscerally feel how anemic and frankly gross this sensibility is. It correlates quite strongly to the entitlement among men's rights activists that being nice to women entitles them to sex. That kindness is a currency put into a machine until intimacy falls out. That abstaining from abuse is a token that makes the church deserving of trust. Fostering trust in the church is going to require shifting our Overton window on acceptable pastoral care drastically beyond boundaries and compliance and into the territory of riskier work as spiritual accomplices who center the experience of survivors. And here I must be crystal clear. The risk must be for the church, not the survivors it aspires to serve. One of the more counterintuitive features of this imperative is that it is going to mean an escalation in liability, not a mitigation. One of the most painful conversations I have with my pastoral care students through clinical assignments is inviting them to reflect in advance on how becoming a pastoral accomplice with survivors of sexual abuse is going to make them important enemies, and that they need to prepare themselves for not backing down. Do you think that I've come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. It gets me I'm sorry, God will strike me dead if I do not break. I mean, I will just say, I've heard a few, frankly, alarming things about prioritizing unity above all in this conversation, which, including talking about it as the tool of people working against unity as the tool of Satan. I am challenged to understand how you're not, in effect, no one in this room, effectively calling Jesus Satan. Jesus said, I'm going to bring division. Believe me, my fears are very real, very, very real. It is terrifying for me not to dwell at length with students on the question, how do I keep myself from crossing boundaries with my congregants? There is a part of me that wants to believe that surely clergy sexual abuse is already such a taboo that we have already moved our Overton window beyond this long ago. Yet, the patterns of the church, of churches, tell a different story of failure, which overshadows that fear for me. It is a fear that makes me embarrassed for any church that even aspires to be seen as trustworthy until it starts asking, what ugly fights must we fight? Sacrifices must we make? And visions of purity must we grieve so that this church might make unrepentant abusers afraid to enter it? It pains me knowing that many of us are not ready to ask this question of ourselves and our church, and that a certain amount of theological training enables so many of us to obviate its claim on us. Yet, if you find yourself resistant to this question, and you continue to wrestle with why so few survivors trust the church today, I would invite you to consider, as non-defensively as possible, that these two things might be connected. Thank you.
If you need to stand up and move for 30 seconds, feel free. I have three short remarks for us, so we have a lot of time to talk for once, because I talked way too long last time, and I thank you for your patience before. The first rule of intelligence and counterintelligence is do not reveal tactics and methods. So I'm going to do the opposite of what I was taught, okay? I want you to grab the handout and go to the last page, please, where I call it a research bibliography for multidisciplinary study. If you don't have one, I think Amy's got some, she can get you one. So what I'm doing with this is I'm giving you the best books I have found over the last 30 years that help me in different stages of work with survivors. Obviously, I'm biased as a Benedictine, so you got to start out with the Desert Fathers and Amnas. I mean, you have, okay. Take it with a grain of salt. Yes, I had to study the rule for a year, so therefore I'm pretty familiar with the book. But I tell you, the best philosophical work that I came across over the years is Love and St. Augustine by Hannah Arendt. And what she did for me is she really set this up as a personal thing. I am the lover, and I know my beloved, and my beloved knows me. And if we work from the individual standpoint, instead of trying to fix this gigantic macro problem that we all recognize, some don't, but that's okay, but many of us recognize, it's overwhelming. And so the only way I have learned to survive over the years is to work with that client or that parishioner right there at that moment in this time. Not in the past, not in the present, right here, right now. Some of these other works are fantastic, depending on what your training is, depending on what your interest is, and you will find different works as you go through the decades. I can say as an old guy now, that certain books really do resonate with you at different points in time. But and you know how it is when somebody hands you a gigantic list that you're probably never get to and you feel completely overwhelmed. Okay, let's go to number one. The Body Keeps the Score. That's the one that has really, really helped me. And I think it's helped me be a better servant in working with clients. The second lesson I want to give you is the power of machine learning. And the third is what I call SEAL Team 7. Under machine learning, and I also include artificial intelligence, I want you to go to the first page of the handout. What stops machine learning and artificial intelligence projects is not having clean data. Learn this the hard way on one particular project, real hard way. So if in the OCR, in the scan, if they can't pull up every digit cleanly, then the machine is not going to be helpful to you. In academia, it'd be like if the dean gave you 15 graduate students, that's what this would be like. I had a dream 25 years ago that I had my own monastery of 100 monks that were actually obedient and did what I told them to do, and then we could actually dive in and go, right? That's what machine learning now helps us to do, because we have the computer power, we have the computer speed, and we now have the OCR capability to pull these documents together to be able to compare, contrast, see how the language change, see what the code words are, and then you as the expert get to teach it what to look for. Now, on the contrary side, and so you could take all of these works I just listed, and I think they're all available in good, clean, they could be available in all clean scans, and put that into a data set then to be able to use machine learning on. We do this in litigation all the time. Otherwise, we get destroyed by too much paperwork to be able to get through within the time period that the civil code gives us to do litigation. You could do this in your own academic research or in whatever particular position you're in. Put the data that you want together. Use the machine learning piece where you teach it the lessons that you've already learned. You've heard me, talk about the geographic solution. Well, essentially what that is taking the official Catholic directory. Remember that big boring brown book that every pastor has that you need, so that if you witness a marriage, then somebody in the parish is obligated to send a letter back to the point of where the kid was baptized to alert them. And the only way to find that is using that book. Well, that book, believe it or not, is actually a tax document. It's an official statement to the IRS regarding tax exempt status. So we're pastorally using that, not for what it was created for. It was created as an agreement between the bishops and the IRS about what pieces of property are tax exempt. And so, you got to have the right people connected to it, and you got to have all of your real property connected to it. So all of a sudden now, what happens, you get a declaration from me or somebody else, and you're in front of a judge, and you say, Your Honor, this is a judicially noticeable document. You have to take it. And you basically there's a fork in the road, Your Honor. Either you believe what the defense lawyer just told you, that Father Joseph was never there, or you have to rule that the church basically lied when they reported it to the IRS. Now, when it comes to property, most people are pretty protective on their property. So what happens is you're able to develop, even if it's imperfect, you're able to develop an exact document without the church giving you any documents of where the guys were. And then you get to see the pattern and practice of how they were moved around. So you see someone, hypothetically, a Jesuit at a high school for a whole bunch of years, and then you see a complaint come in, and then all of a sudden, you see him move to the Diocese of Rapid City. And then another thing comes in, and then all of a sudden, he's gone from the official Catholic directory. He is in Africa. That is how you use documentation to be able to prove it's like a shadow proof of what they knew and when they knew it, because they acted. So it's the use of documents of what you have, what's capable. I want to draw the distinction between machine learning you as the expert saying this is what you can get from this, to artificial intelligence. You don't tell it anything. You just give it a clean scan of data and you just let it figure out the insights that it has. And what I have found so amazing is how much I missed. I could not believe, I thought, oh, I've got all this wisdom and insight. Oh my goodness. Artificial intelligence will be able to take those same documents, assuming again you've got a clean scan, and to be able to give you new insights into that data you've been looking at. So you could take, has anybody here read all of Augustine? I doubt it. You'd be able to get through all of Augustine and see what some of the insights are from that, or whatever your particular area of expertise is. So it's an important tool that's now available that you didn't have 5 years ago. Third idea, and then I will recede. SEAL Team 7, basically the concept is you build a team, multidisciplinary. I think it's wonderful that they have a criminologist on their team, because in criminology, they have a concept that I learned a few years ago called white collar crime, the use of committing crime in what looks like the normal operation of their profession. So each discipline has another way to look at the facts or to look at the data and to pull out incredible information. So that's why if you have a team of at least 5 different people from viewing the world in their own disciplines, you're going to get a whole nother insight as to what you're doing. And you can do this, I believe, even on the survivor side. You've heard me say that the absence of data for survivors is almost criminal, the way it is. But if we start to build that data, then we'll be able to be able to continue to move forward. The biggest data set, of course, are on the bad actors, and so we'll be able to see greater patterns in that, and we'll be able to come to a clearer understanding. I mean, nobody wants to sit there and listen to Oliver like on Deliver Us from Evil. You really don't want to sit there and listen to Oliver too long. I mean, he is such a magical thinker in how he sees things. But it's important to at least know that's what's going on, and that's what some of our kids encountered, right? So and then finally, so in doing the SEAL Team 7 to be able to pull out the insights using everything that we now have available, I would encourage you to continue to use the theme of music to be able to harmonize everything that you have, so that if you find on your team that you've developed that there is a large range of sound that's missing. Now, obviously, I'm biased because I'm a bass. You got to have basses, otherwise there's no music, right? So but there's going to be gaps in the whole sound. If you complete the whole area of sound with countertenors and sopranos that screech up there, and you have all of even some of the tenors, you go, oh, and then so you have the whole sound pattern as well as the child, right? Then you're going to have a much greater depth of being able to serve people, do your investigations, and do the work that you're after. Thank you for listening.
I am delighted and a little astonished to report that we have a lot of time for questions. And I'll repeat for those of you who weren't here earlier that if you could come to the mic in the center of the room to ask your questions. And I think we had said that it was all right to ask questions of all the participants in the conference generally, that we should think of this as maybe a frame building exercise. But it's also fine to address our panelists from this panel. And maybe we could get our third panelist up on the screen. Thanks.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Fetter. I'm really interested in your research, and I'm just curious about if you know what kind of timeline or venue there will be for the completion of this research and also for that of other folks participating in the grant that you mentioned.
We are hoping, our timeline officially runs out at August 15th, but my hunch is that, we have caught a passion for this, and I think that we'll keep working on it as long as it takes to get to something that's substantial and that we can report and publish. So we'll see, but that's the official deadline.
Just one quick comment here, because I've litigated with the Jesuits for quite a while. One thing that they've done on the macro level that you need to be aware of that may not be obvious is they've moved all their archives out of the various provinces now to St. Louis into one gigantic building. And it may be an accident, but one of the most favorable states in the union from a discovery standpoint as far as protecting institutional defendants is the state of Missouri. And that's also where the servants of the Paraclete have retreated back to as well. Their USA headquarters is in Missouri.
Clever bunch, those Jesuits. First of all, Julie, I just lament with you and look forward to our time in New York. One of the key things, just to answer your question, is it's a major conference of all of us who are taking part in the Taking Responsibility Project. You can go onto Fordham's website. There's a major conference at the end of April, 23rd and 24th, starting with a panel of survivors of Jesuit abuse, Paul Eli and myself, and some Native American survivors. I think it's really an important watershed moment for Fordham, but also because, Julie, I can't remember how many Jesuit institutions are participating. I know Marcus is part of that study at Xavier, and then Marquette. So I think there's about 10 to 12 major universities that are participating, Boston College, of course, and Georgetown. And it's really trying to unfold and uncover what you're looking at. And as someone from the inside, I experience it personally. First of all, I just want to thank you all. I could not agree more, Peter, with your insight about the fact that unless we sort of, as we prayed this morning, go to the upper room where there's utter confusion and division, and that's the founding of the place of church, then we've missed the point of what does it mean for us to be vulnerable? What does it mean for us to be a people of the entire Christ event, which is about betrayal, hope, service, death, and resurrection. So unless we view that as a whole, it's horrible. I am absolutely bowled over the fact that anyone today would suggest to pray it away. And that's what I heard in the same, sort of insight that you're referring to in regards to what does it mean for us to have erotic experiences and then just flee to the contemplative. That unfortunately has been the MO of certain formation programs, continues to be the MO of certain formation programs, and is dangerous. That's what got us into this quagmire in the first place. But I just want to thank you all. And Julia, keep at it and look forward to seeing you in New York.
So greetings. Hi, Julia, old friend, and wonderful presentation. And thank you for a great panel. So I very much applaud this wonderful effort towards truth and transparency and the case you made for it and all that you're trying to do for it. I've studied national truth and reconciliation processes. One of the most common themes is we need to get the truth out. This leads to the truth commissions and so forth before we can build trust and engage in other restorative measures. And that seems to be kind of what you're doing. Interestingly, even in the national level, one of the main obstacles is what we learned in the legal panel before, which is the kind of the liability prosecution dynamic. Often there are trials happening at the same time. They say, well, you can't have the Truth Commission because that's people are not going to want to share information that they're then liable to in the criminal courts. But what we learned in 2 panels ago is that that seems to be a similar challenge. And both Mr. Wall and Father Kimes, in different ways, spoke about the challenge of the criminal justice, and you spoke about criminal liability and avoiding publicity. And so how do we, that's a challenge. How do we get around that? If truth is so important, and I believe it is, and bringing it out, how do we get around the problem when they say, maybe well-intentioned, that we just can't do that because that, lands us in court, or that makes us liable, and so forth? How do we overcome what seems to be a tension between the truth-telling dynamic and the legal accountability dynamic?
I'm not certain I'm going to be able to advise on the details of especially managing canon law liability, though. But no, this point is a challenging one, and I will say I hope this is clear from what I shared, and perhaps it wasn't. But in terms of how is it that we are going to be able to maybe move forward, begin doing some truth telling, and bear the brunt of some of the legitimate liability that we've earned through failure. I think that, and everyone seems to be on board with this, there are going to be costs. Like we've earned liability. There are going to be costs. It's going to be painful. It's already been painful. It's going to continue being more and more painful. But the one thing that I just cannot, it is very weird to be thinking about, like, things are in a place where the fixation on liability feels overwhelming. It feels like there's a huge gravity to this conversation, and for good reason. I do think long term, like, part of truth telling is also going to be incorporating the truth that we already know and setting a tone for really changing the expectations of what survivors actually might expect from the church. I know that this is a peculiar way of framing it, but again, I'm sure that many people are like, who is this irresponsible pastoral care professor who's leading all of his students astray? But in defense of this approach is that several people have made this point throughout the conference about, like, what would it look like? It's an excellent question. What would it look like for us to actually get the church to a place where people expect healing from it? And I know one of the simple ways is, again, when I'm talking with people heading into pastoral ministry, like, maintaining your boundaries is like, it needs to lower to the level of, like, this is not even remarkable. Like, you need to be doing more in your face advocacy work with people. And I will, to get concrete, most of my energy and attention is around what happens when an abuser emerges in your church and tries to triangulate against you and manipulate you in very harmful ways. That is the sort of work that we need to be preparing people for. And I do think that that is going to be a way to, again, it's in my mind, one of the essential steps if we are going to begin moving beyond just the absolute fixation and gravity on liability and begin maybe earning in some distant future something that resembles trust from others.
Just one quick comment. I found, oh, geez, you want to say something? Real quick, one quick story. One of the things that was so insightful from the involuntary laicization of Father Oliver O'Grady in the Diocese of Stockton was that Father Gregory Engels, a canonist from the Archdiocese of San Francisco, he not only used Canon 1395.2, I think it has a new number in the current code, but he also used Canon 1044, basically saying that Oliver was insane. He had a psychic infirmity, are the magic words that were used. And in order to be able to prove that up, Greg had to bring forward all the information from all the different reports. I think if we would have known that 20, 25 years ago when he put that together, we'd be further down the line from a learning standpoint, right? Because somebody in San Francisco really knew, and somebody in Stockton really knew, and somebody at the congregation level really knew the full implications of all of this. And that would have been a great learning lesson, painful as all get out, but it would have been a painful and positive learning lesson. So, maybe, maybe some of our guys do have a serious mental illness, and they should not have been ordained, and we didn't make a great decision on that one. So let's just not do it again. Let's learn and move forward. And second of all, I would just say, man, if you really want to send a clear message, if you're an ordinary, report the guy to the FBI. That's a pretty clear message. It only takes about one or two, and the group is going to get the hint. That's my recommendation. Don't try and be fancy on a macro level. Work on the very specific, and then people will get the hint eventually.
Julia?
Yeah, I just can echo that this dynamic that Dr. Philpott's noting, I'm being tested on recognizing people by their back, the back of their head.
I was going to tell you his name, but now you've clarified that you don't need it.
And I'm happy to recognize people's voices a little bit too. That's nice. This is the dynamic. I don't know what else to say except just to name, that really is the tension I think that we're working with in our institutions. Do we have the courage to choose to open ourselves up to greater liability, as Dr. Capretto's naming, and have that be a spiritual posture of courage and, imitating Jesus in that way. It sounds trite to even name that, and it sounds also dumb in the way that I like how Dr. Capretto put that. It's like it's almost insulting to name it that way, but it's like this is what it is. I don't know, So I can just affirm that we've heard that in our research, in the course of our research too, that named quite explicitly by Jesuits that we've asked for information. They have said, we cannot tell you because statutes of limitations are being rolled back. And, talking with you opens us up to liability, and I don't want to risk my friends' retirement funds. And by the way, we're also doing a great job. Please talk with our victim assistance coordinator to hear all of the ways that we fix this already. We don't need to talk with you. So I think that's a problem. To say something stupid,
Hi, thank you all so much for all your wisdom and sharing on this issue. I just had a question. Peter, you mentioned training ministers for that moment where they have to turn someone in. And I was in MDiv school during the McCarrick Report, and I turned to one of the seminarians who I was in my class, and he was like, I don't know how to even emotionally process having to do that to someone that I love and know, right? And just thinking through the reality of the emotional reality of the complicated and manipulative experience that comes up in these moments. What are the kind of concrete trainings you have around this to prepare folks to really be able to respond well when emotions are running high and mental confusion and manipulation may be in place?
That is a wonderful question that has a lot of tendrils to it. So there are, in terms of managing one's own emotions, of course, I teach a course in trauma-informed care where this issue comes up quite considerably. So there are, of course, for faith leaders, people have mentioned things such as grounding techniques, anything that helps to manage the arousal cycle and to mitigate trends in hyperarousal in particular. But specifically for those sorts of encounters, if anyone here is, I imagine most of you are, but if anyone of you is not familiar with the research of Jennifer Freyd on DARVO tactics among perpetrators of violence, the acronym is going to elude me, deny, accuse, reverse victim order, which is essentially a very empirically supported pattern that abusers have used in order to avoid accountability when confronted, where essentially what do? They do everything that they can in order to pivot away from accountability, to put others in the hot seat, and to essentially make it impossible to pin them down. I go over very heavily with my students. You need to be aware that this pattern exists. It is uncomfortable, and you need to be aware of the fact that there are going to be people to whom you minister who will practice this. That is a really uncomfortable insight for them to sit with, but having eyes to see those manipulative patterns, specifically around being held accountable for abuse, I think is a sort of non-negotiable starter. From there, having eyes to see the ways that people manipulate others and avoid accountability, a lot of it, there's a lot of good work that I point students to just around managing power dynamics and imbalances in ministry work. There are a lot. I'm not, I like drawing upon some philosophical discourse on power, so I go in that direction. But if you want to get practical, the work of pastoral theologian Carrie Doring on managing power imbalances around and including boundary work. So boundaries aren't all bad, they're good, they're just not even close to enough. Being able to just, I think, again, mentally framing and preparing people. You may think that the primary responsibility for you in managing sexual abuse in your work is going to be not abusing people. That is just such a terribly inadequate framing. You are going to fight people. You need to be able to, I absolutely love also, Patrick, your attention to knowing the tactics of other people. This is gonna sound a big research. In fact, my project really that I haven't talked about a lot is empathy, and weird, I know. And one of the things that is very counterintuitive and peculiar, if empathy precisely is a practice of vicarious introspection, knowing the mental states and emotional states of others and thinking very intensely about that. This old maxim, know your enemy, is a call to empathy. And I mean that as precisely and literally as possible. Knowing how other people move, including one's enemy, is a process of vicariously introspecting into their strategies, their emotional states, their mental states, which include things like avoiding accountability and exerting power abuses against people around them. When I'm working with ministry students, that is the direction I want to be taking when I'm training them on intervening in pastoral abuses and sexual abuse and trauma, not merely boundary training.
Thank you to the presenters, and I've not been able to be here for the whole conference, but it's clear to me from the sessions that I have attended how passionate everyone in this room is about making this right. And so I'm really inspired by all the questions and all the presenters, and I appreciate what you all are doing. So as my lens personally, as I've been listening and hearing, is I'm a former advocate for survivors of domestic violence. Currently, I'm educating young minds in math, so I'm not really part of the current conversation in the church in terms of except as a practicing Catholic. So I hope this question isn't too far afield, but one of the themes that I've been hearing is the individual approach, the need for healing. I think there was also restoring a sense of the sacred. There's a loss of trust in God. And so as I was reflecting on that, I looked at the Catechism as a former attorney, and it talks about God's parental tenderness can also be expressed by the image of motherhood. And I'm just wondering if that, and this is in the catechism's discussion in the creed, and I hope I'm not taking that out of context, because it talks about the fallibility of humans can deface or disfigure the face of fatherhood and motherhood. So in terms of healing and in terms of people trusting the church again, I was just wondering, and maybe this was more appropriate for an earlier panel, but I'm just wondering if that conversation is happening in terms of when survivors are seeking access back in the church, when they're trying to heal, when they're trying to rebuild, is that part of the conversation about at the pastoral level, in the parishes? It might be a conversation at the academic level, but is it reaching the parishes that the face of God, when we talk about God as Father, that's inevitably flawed, but powerful. And so the face of God as Mother, and it gets complicated because we have Mary, our mother, and there's all this other stuff. But I was just wondering, and Mr. Hall, or Wallace, you talked about the individual's healing or the individual approach. Is that part of the conversation of shifting that narrative and really embracing the individual path back and what that looks like in our lexicon on the parish level?
I think it's really important that civil law stay completely out of the operation of the church.
Fair enough.
Constitutionally, it's really, really important because it may be all right today, but down the line, we may have some real idiots in charge, and then all of a sudden, no church is free. So I have serious macro concerns that way. But I do believe from past experience in working with folks, the individual approach is the way you get to macro success. There is no, and as long as you don't have an expectation where you can fill a cathedral full of survivors somehow, it's always amazing. Every once in a while, you get those ideas from folks. I just don't think that the vast majority of survivors that I know are ever going to come out of the darkness. They're always going to remain in the shadows because that's the only place they feel comfortable. The one thing I can tell you that they're all really good at is keeping track online where their perpetrator is. They have Google alerts on their perpetrator. So if that person, male or female, pops up somewhere, they're the first to know. And because I get their phone calls, right? Did you see that Oliver's now in Waterford? Or things like that, moving, out of North Dublin, things like that. And I just don't, I don't have any kind of macro plan in my head to see that way forward. There are a lot smarter people here, I think, that should comment.
Yeah, I mean, Julia, I don't know if you want to address the other half of the question, or I will if you don't want to.
I'm happy for you to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, especially like we do talk in liturgical studies, especially, which is my field. We talk about the importance of liturgical language, and that was something I kind of alluded to really briefly, maybe too quickly, in the conversation we were having last night, which you might not have been here for. But I think it is really important. And of course, we've had motherhood language in the church for as long as there's been a church for God, and beforehand in the Hebrew scriptures, we have it. And I think, but you're probably right that that's not well enough known at the parish level. So I think that's true. It's something that might be helpful to make explicit, especially. We work on it in the program here. I feel a little bit incompetent. I am, of course, an academic theologian. So yes, it's like very well known in the field. I know in the department we work really hard on at least like allowing students to experience gender neutral language and metaphors for God. And that's one of the reasons it's especially important, I think, in the MDiv program. And I was talking last night about the need to get away from just thinking that every liturgy is not only, but especially in populations that have experienced sexual violence, like mass is maybe not the best liturgical approach for those people. And so this would fit into that pattern of like diversifying our liturgical language in order to better serve the needs of recovery for people who are survivors of sexual violence. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we probably have time for maybe one more question. I see David has been holding a question.
So these come from the those that are online from the chat. One was just, will the documents be posted for those that are online? And we'll make sure that the documents handed out at the conference are posted for you. We have, I think, your emails through registration. Another question was directed to Peter, just asking if you could restate your concluding question at the end about what to ask oneself in the church. And then the third is somewhat longer. I'm going to read it. It's actually from Jennifer Bestie, one of our first panelists. And she asks, how can we collectively, as scholars, theologians, psychologists, and lawyers, most effectively place pressure on Catholic bishops and religious order leaders to allow us access to the archives so that we can tell the truth and then legitimately help the church to pursue justice and healing? The scholars in the Notre Dame Cushwas Center Working Group, Clergy, Sexual Abuse, Gender, Sex, and Power, have encountered the same problems of being blocked. Should we collectively publish a letter appealing to the Catholic bishops and religious leaders in the New York Times, clearly informing lay Catholics about the lack of transparency, and make the case truth-telling must occur first before healing and restoration of trust can occur? And those are the questions that came in from the chat.
All right. And for the benefit of Dr. Bestie and Dr. Feder, who cannot see the audience, I want to convey to you the very enthusiastic nodding and clapping that we got in response to that last question. So I think, yeah, that is something that we can work on in the follow-up to the conference. And now I'll let Dr. Capretto answer his question.
Yeah, I will very briefly reread this question and pass it over to others. So the question, which I shouldn't state as a universal thing to be working through, but I do think it is important. The question that I said is that I feel embarrassed for any church that even aspires to be seen as trustworthy until it starts asking, what ugly fights must we fight? Sacrifices must we make? In visions of purity must we grieve, so that this church might make unrepentant abusers afraid to enter it? And I want to stress, I could elaborate upon this at length. Two things I will note very modestly. Unrepentant, I think, is important. And I will say, Patrick, your point earlier about needing to know someone's ecclesiology, and if they are, this is from your prior panel, I've been thinking about this a lot. The thing that I will just note on this is I recognize that many people hear that question as not compassionate. You want me to make this space a church, a sacred space, something that people are afraid of? Like, my response to that is, survivors have become afraid to enter this space. When you are ignoring this claim or deflecting it, you are saying, I care more about the fear of perpetrators than I do of survivors. That is non-negotiable. That is something that, again, I wish nothing more than for it to be a space that is not fearful to anyone. The actions of others have changed the playing field. Some people are going to need to be afraid to enter it. They should not be survivors.
Amen. One of the questions, final questions, and Julie, you and I have already talked about this, is how do we keep this energy, this richness of insight going? And perhaps we break down into small groups according to interest areas and then come together with you and David. But I do want to strategize with others, maybe perhaps at dinner tonight, but also those online, as to how do we keep the the great work you've done in organizing us. And I do want to acknowledge you all publicly at the end of this to give you, just a round of applause to say thank you for what you've done for us.
I think I can hazard on David's behalf, since I have a microphone and he doesn't, that we will be in touch for follow-up conversations. And I think it's time now for us to go and hear and see the passion that the full choir has been putting together. My hope is that it provides an emotional and healing capstone to this conference. The building is actually one of those wonderful and controversial buildings that's attached to the stadium. I can lead you there, and we can start in maybe 5 minutes. I did message JJ, so he knows we're a few minutes behind. I don't consider that any problem, but we won't want to delay unduly because the students are waiting for us.